In the autumn of 1848, when construction workers began demolishing the abandoned St. Mary's Academy for young ladies in Salem, Massachusetts, they made a discovery that would haunt the town for generations. Hidden beneath the Academy's chapel floorboards, sealed in a lead-lined box, were 47 small leather journals, each bearing the name of a different girl. The pages contained detailed accounts of unspeakable horrors. But what terrified investigators most were the meticulously kept client records, listing names that read like a who's who of New England's political elite. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts immediately sealed the findings, claiming public safety concerns, and to this day those records remain classified in the state archives. What I'm about to tell you comes from testimonies that were never meant to see the light of day, documents that powerful families tried desperately to bury, and the dying confession of a woman who carried these secrets for 60 years. If you're someone who seeks the truth behind America's darkest secrets, someone who isn't afraid to peer into the shadows of our nation's past, then this story is for you. But I must warn you, what happened at St. Mary's Academy challenges everything we thought we knew about respectability, power, and innocence in 19th century New England. Before we descend into this abyss of human corruption, hit that subscribe button if you're brave enough to uncover the mysteries that others dare not tell. And let me know in the comments what state you're listening from, because this horror could have happened anywhere. Now let me take you back to a time when evil wore the mask of virtue. Salem, Massachusetts in 1811 was a city still haunted by its infamous past, yet determined to reinvent itself as a beacon of moral righteousness and educational progress. The witch trials of 1692 had left an indelible stain on the community's reputation. And by the early 19th century, Salem's leading families were desperately seeking ways to restore their town's standing in the eyes of New England society. It was into this atmosphere of redemption and reinvention that the Fairfax family arrived, carrying with them impeccable credentials and a vision that would captivate the town's elite. Victoria Fairfax was a woman of remarkable presence. Tall, elegant, with steel-gray eyes that seemed to peer directly into one's soul. Born to a wealthy Virginia plantation family, she had received the finest education available to women of her station. Her husband, Dr. Cornelius Fairfax, had died in a yellow fever outbreak in Charleston, leaving her widowed at 32 with a substantial inheritance and a burning desire to dedicate her life to the moral elevation of young womanhood. When Victoria announced her intention to establish the St. Mary's Academy for young ladies in Salem, the town's Congregationalist leadership embraced her vision with enthusiasm. Here was a woman of obvious refinement and Christian virtue, offering to provide free education to orphaned and impoverished girls, while also accepting paying students from respectable families. The building Victoria selected for her academy had a history as complicated as Salem itself. The imposing three-story Georgian mansion on Beacon Hill had been constructed in 1787 by merchant Samuel Hartwell, who had made his fortune in the China trade. After Hartwell's death in 1809, the property had stood empty, its dark windows overlooking Salem Harbor like dead eyes. Local residents whispered that the house was cursed. 3 different families had attempted to live there, and each had fled within months, citing strange sounds and an oppressive atmosphere. But Victoria Fairfax showed no fear of such superstitions. She purchased the property for a fraction of its assessed value and immediately began extensive renovations. Workmen added a chapel wing complete with stained glass windows depicting scenes from the lives of female saints. They constructed dormitories that could house 30 girls, a dining hall that could seat 50, and most notably a series of private chambers on the 3rd floor that Victoria described as meditation rooms. Joining Victoria in her noble endeavor were 2 family members who shared her passion for education and moral guidance. Evangeline Fairfax, Victoria's younger sister, was a delicate woman with prematurely gray hair and hands that trembled slightly when she spoke, a condition she attributed to a childhood fever. Despite her fragile appearance, Evangeline possessed a remarkable gift for music and languages, and she would serve as the Academy's primary instructor in these subjects. The 3rd member of the Fairfax triumvirate was Bartholomew Fairfax, Victoria's brother-in-law, and a man whose presence seemed to cast a shadow even in bright sunlight. Tall and gaunt, with deep-set eyes and a voice that carried the authority of absolute conviction, Bartholomew had spent 15 years as a traveling preacher throughout the southern states before answering Victoria's call to serve as the Academy's chaplain. His sermons on the corruption of the modern world and the special vulnerability of young women to Satan's temptations were legendary throughout the region. The Academy officially opened its doors on September 15, 1811, with great fanfare. Salem's mayor attended the dedication ceremony along with several state legislators and the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts. Victoria's opening address, delivered from the steps of the Academy as autumn leaves swirled around her black silk dress, spoke of creating a sanctuary of learning where young ladies could develop both intellectual accomplishment and moral strength. The first students to enter St. Mary's Academy were a carefully selected group of 23 girls ranging in age from 12 to 17. Some came from respectable Salem families who paid the substantial tuition of $50 per year, a sum that represented several months' wages for a working man. But Victoria's stated mission was to serve those less fortunate, and more than half of the initial enrollment consisted of orphans and daughters of impoverished families accepted without charge as demonstrations of the Academy's Christian charity. Among these charity students was 14-year-old Margaret Sullivan, whose Irish immigrant parents had died in a tenement fire the previous winter. Margaret was a bright-spirited girl with red hair and green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. She had been working in a textile mill for 6 months when a representative of the Academy approached her with an offer that seemed too good to be true. Free room, board, and education in exchange for helping with domestic duties around the Academy. Another was 15-year-old Priscilla Morse, whose father had been lost at sea and whose mother had died of consumption, leaving her in the care of an uncle. The third was 13-year-old Hannah Whitmore, perhaps the most tragic case of all. Hannah's father had been convicted of theft and sentenced to 5 years in prison, while her mother had simply disappeared one night, leaving behind only a note saying she could no longer bear the shame. Hannah had been living in the Salem poorhouse when Victoria Fairfax personally visited and offered her a place at the Academy. The girl's pale, hollow-cheeked face had brightened for the first time in months when she learned she would have her own bed, regular meals, and the chance to learn to read properly. These girls, along with their 20 classmates, entered St. Mary's Academy with hearts full of hope and gratitude. They had no way of knowing that they were walking into a carefully constructed trap, that the woman who promised to protect their virtue was about to steal their innocence, and that the elegant Georgian mansion overlooking Salem Harbor would become their prison, their nightmare, and for many of them, their tomb. The first hint that something was amiss at St. Mary's Academy came not from the students themselves, but from Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a seamstress who lived in a modest cottage at the base of Beacon Hill. Mrs. Thornton had been commissioned to provide linens and clothing for the Academy, and her weekly deliveries gave her occasion to observe the daily routines of the institution from a distance. It was on a gray October morning in 1812, exactly 13 months after the Academy's opening, that Mrs. Thornton first noticed something peculiar. She had arrived earlier than usual to deliver a shipment of winter cloaks, and was surprised to see several well-dressed gentlemen departing from the Academy's side entrance. What struck her as odd was not merely their early morning departure, but their obvious efforts to avoid being seen. They moved quickly to waiting carriages, keeping their heads down and their hat brims low over their faces. Over the following weeks, Mrs. Thornton began to pay closer attention to the comings and goings at the Academy. She noticed that these mysterious visitors always arrived after dark and always used the side entrance. Sometimes there would be only 1 or 2 carriages. Other nights she counted as many as 6. More disturbing still were the changes she observed in the students themselves. The girls who had entered the Academy with bright faces and eager expressions were becoming increasingly withdrawn and hollow-eyed. During her deliveries, Mrs. Thornton would occasionally catch glimpses of them through windows, and what she saw troubled her deeply. Many appeared listless and moved with a strange, dreamlike quality, as if they were walking through water. Some bore visible marks, bruises on their arms that were hastily concealed beneath long sleeves. The transformation was most noticeable in Margaret Sullivan, the spirited Irish girl who had once chatted excitedly about her studies whenever Mrs. Thornton encountered her. By winter, Margaret rarely spoke at all. Her vibrant red hair had become dull and lifeless, hanging in limp strands around a face that had grown gaunt and pale. When she did meet Mrs. Thornton's eyes, there was something desperate in her gaze, as if she were trying to communicate a message she dared not speak aloud. It was on the night of December 13th, 1812, that Mrs. Thornton witnessed something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Unable to sleep due to a persistent cough, she had risen from her bed around midnight to brew some chamomile tea. As she stood by her kitchen window waiting for the water to boil, she noticed unusual activity at the academy. Light flickered in the third-floor windows, not the steady glow of candles or oil lamps, but an erratic dancing illumination that suggested torches. But then she heard sounds that made her blood run cold, muffled screaming that seemed to come from the academy's chapel. The sounds were intermittent, lasting only a few seconds at a time, but they were unmistakably human and unmistakably expressions of agony or terror. As Mrs. Thornton pressed her face against the cold window glass, straining to see more clearly, the chapel windows glowed with that same strange, flickering light, and she could make out shadowy figures moving inside. When morning came, Mrs. Thornton convinced herself that she must have been mistaken, that her fever and exhaustion had caused her to imagine things. But when she made her next delivery to the academy 3 days later, she learned that one of the students, young Hannah Whitmore, had died suddenly during the night of December 13th. Victoria Fairfax, dressed in mourning clothes that somehow made her appear more imposing than grieving, explained that the girl had succumbed to a sudden fever. The funeral was held the following morning in the academy's chapel, a small private service attended only by the faculty and students. Mrs. Thornton was not invited, but she could hear the hymns drifting down from the hill, sung in voices that seemed more fearful than mournful. Hannah Whitmore was buried in the small cemetery behind the academy, marked with a simple stone cross bearing only her name and dates of birth and death. No family members attended the service because she had no family left. In the weeks that followed Hannah's death, Mrs. Thornton noticed that several other students seemed to be ailing. They moved more slowly, spoke even less frequently, and displayed the same listless behavior that had characterized Hannah in her final days. When she discreetly inquired about their health, Victoria Fairfax assured her that the girls were simply experiencing the normal effects of intensive academic study combined with the moral discipline necessary for their spiritual development. But Mrs. Thornton's suspicions were not so easily dismissed. She began to take careful note of which students appeared to be struggling, and she noticed a disturbing pattern. The girls who seemed most affected were invariably among the poorest, those who had no families to inquire about their welfare or financial resources to leave the academy if they chose. The paying students, while certainly more subdued than when they had first arrived, maintained better color in their cheeks and greater alertness in their eyes. The pattern became impossible to ignore when, in February of 1813, 2 more students died within a single week. Priscilla Morse, the quiet girl who had loved to read, was found dead in her bed on a Tuesday morning, apparently having passed away peacefully in her sleep. 3 days later, Mary Catherine O'Brien, another Irish orphan, succumbed to what was described as brain fever after a brief illness characterized by violent convulsions. Both girls were buried in the Academy Cemetery with the same simple ceremony. Their deaths were reported to the town authorities. But since Dr. Fairfax's cousin, Dr. Edmund Fairfax, served as both the Academy's physician and the official coroner for that district, the deaths were officially attributed to natural causes without further investigation. Mrs. Thornton found herself torn between her growing suspicions and her awareness that she was just a simple seamstress with no evidence beyond her own observations. Who would believe her if she suggested that something sinister was happening at Salem's most prestigious academy for young ladies? Yet she could not shake the image of those flickering lights in the chapel windows or the memory of those muffled screams echoing through the December night. Something terrible was happening on Beacon Hill, something that the respectable facade of St. Mary's Academy was designed to conceal. But it would be years before the truth began to emerge, and when it did, The reality would prove to be far more horrific than even Mrs. Thornton's darkest suspicions had imagined. By the spring of 1813, a strange quietude had settled over St. Mary's Academy for young ladies, as if the very walls had absorbed the sorrow and secrets within them and now emanated an oppressive silence. The death of 3 students within 4 months had cast a pall over the institution. Yet life continued with a routine that suggested these losses were merely unfortunate interruptions in the Academy's noble mission. Victoria Fairfax adapted to these tragedies with what observers noted as remarkable composure. Her sermons to the remaining students took on an increasingly intense quality, dwelling on themes of sacrifice, submission, and the necessity of absolute obedience. "Young ladies," she would intone from the chapel pulpit, her steel-gray eyes sweeping across the assembled students, "you must understand that your previous lives have left marks upon your souls that can only be cleansed through the most rigorous spiritual discipline. The path to redemption is not easy, and some among you may not possess the strength necessary to complete the journey." The surviving students had learned to listen to these addresses with carefully composed expressions that revealed nothing of their inner thoughts. They had learned that displays of emotion or independent thinking were not welcomed at St. Mary's Academy. Those who asked too many questions found themselves assigned to increasingly unpleasant duties, scrubbing floors with lye soap, working in the garden during the hottest part of summer days, or spending long hours alone in the third-floor meditation rooms. Margaret Sullivan, now 15 and barely recognizable as the spirited girl who had entered the academy 18 months earlier, had become a master of this emotional concealment. She moved through her daily routines like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to and keeping her thoughts locked away. But beneath this carefully constructed exterior, Margaret's mind remained sharp and observant. She had begun to notice patterns in the academy's routines that troubled her deeply. She had observed, for instance, that certain students were periodically selected for what Evangeline Fairfax called special instruction in the third-floor chambers. These sessions always took place in the evening. The girls chosen would disappear upstairs immediately after dinner, often remaining there until well past midnight. When they returned to the dormitory, they moved with the same dreamlike quality that had characterized Hannah, Priscilla, and Mary Catherine. In their final weeks, more disturbing still was Margaret's growing awareness that these special instruction sessions coincided with the visits of the mysterious gentlemen who arrived in unmarked carriages. Through careful observation, she had determined that the side entrance was used exclusively during these nocturnal meetings. Margaret had also noticed that students who participated in multiple sessions began to display physical symptoms that went beyond mere fatigue. They would sit quietly during meals, picking at their food with little appetite, and many complained of persistent headaches and stomach ailments. The academy's routine during this period was rigidly structured, designed to eliminate any opportunity for the students to communicate freely among themselves. The day began at 5 with chapel service, followed by a sparse breakfast. Classes ran from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening, with only a brief break for a midday meal. Evenings were devoted to moral instruction, lengthy sessions in which Bartholomew Fairfax would read from specially selected religious texts while the students sat in absolute silence. This schedule left the girls exhausted and isolated, unable to form the bonds of friendship that might have provided comfort. Those who attempted to communicate through whispered conversations found themselves subjected to severe punishments. Yet despite these precautions, information began to spread among the students through a network of subtle gestures and meaningful glances. Margaret Sullivan emerged as an unofficial leader in this underground communication system. Through these covert channels, Margaret learned that the special instruction sessions involved more than religious education. Girls described being given strange-tasting tea that made them feel dizzy and disoriented, followed by activities that they found difficult to remember clearly afterward. Some recalled being dressed in unusual clothing, white gowns that resembled burial shrouds. Others remembered being required to participate in ceremonies that involved candles, incense, and recited prayers in languages they did not recognize. Most disturbing of all were the accounts of the gentlemen who attended these sessions. The girls described men of various ages, all well-dressed and clearly prosperous, who spoke with the accents of education and refinement, but whose eyes held a hunger that made the students instinctively afraid. These men would observe the ceremonies from chairs arranged around the perimeter of the third-floor chambers, sometimes participating in the prayers and rituals. As winter gave way to spring in 1813, Margaret began to understand that they were prisoners in an institution that functioned as something far more sinister. The realization filled her with a mixture of terror and determination. She had survived longer than Hannah, Priscilla, and Mary Catherine, but she could see the same symptoms beginning to manifest in herself. But Margaret Sullivan had not endured 2 years of poverty and suffering only to surrender without a fight. As the spring progressed, she began to formulate a desperate plan. The opportunity Margaret Sullivan had been waiting for came in the form of Miss Constance Hartwell, a young woman whose arrival at St. Mary's Academy in September of 1813 would prove to be the catalyst for events that Victoria Fairfax could never have anticipated. Miss Hartwell was not a student, but a new instructor hired to teach mathematics and natural philosophy. Her presence represented a significant departure from the Fairfax family's previous practice of keeping all educational duties within their immediate circle. Constance Hartwell was 24 years old, the daughter of a prosperous Boston merchant who had provided her with a remarkable education. She had studied at Miss Willard's female seminary in Troy, New York, where she had been exposed to progressive ideas about women's education. Unlike the subdued atmosphere at St. Mary's, Miss Willard's institution had encouraged critical thinking and open discussion. Miss Hartwell had accepted the position for reasons both practical and idealistic. From her first day at the academy, Constance noticed inconsistencies that troubled her analytical mind. The students were clearly intelligent, but they displayed a curious passivity. When she asked questions designed to stimulate discussion, she was met with blank stares and mechanical recitations. More puzzling still was the students' apparent fear of expressing opinions or asking questions of their own. They seemed to have had all intellectual curiosity systematically suppressed. During her first weeks, Constance attributed these observations to the rigorous religious discipline. But as the autumn progressed, she began to suspect that something beyond ordinary religious education was responsible. The first concrete evidence came during a mathematics lesson in October when she noticed that one of her brightest students, Sarah Peaton, was having difficulty concentrating. Sarah's hands trembled as she worked, and she frequently lost track of her calculations. When Constance gently inquired, Sarah whispered, "I'm sorry, Miss Hartwell. Sometimes my mind feels cloudy, like there's a fog inside my head that makes it hard to think clearly. Dr. Fairfax says it's because my spirit is being purified, but I remember being able to think more clearly before I came here." This conversation planted the first seeds of serious concern in Constance's mind. She began to pay closer attention to the physical condition of her students, and what she observed alarmed her. Constance's growing suspicions were confirmed when she discovered that her access to certain areas of the academy was strictly limited. She had been assigned quarters on the second floor, but the third floor was declared off-limits to all faculty except members of the Fairfax family. When she innocently inquired about using one of the third-floor rooms for private tutoring, Victoria Fairfax's reaction was swift and decisive. The firmness of this prohibition convinced Constance that the third floor held secrets. It was during a covert observation that Constance first encountered Margaret Sullivan in circumstances that would forge an alliance between them. On a November evening, Constance noticed a figure moving stealthily through the corridor that led to the side entrance. The figure was Margaret, wearing a white gown. Constance followed at a distance and watched as Margaret approached the side entrance and pressed her ear against the door. When Margaret spotted Constance in the shadows, both young women froze. Finally, Margaret stepped forward, her green eyes meeting Constance's with intensity. "Miss Hartwell," she whispered, "I need to speak with you, but not here and not now. Tomorrow during your mathematics class, ask me to stay after to discuss my work. I have things to tell you that you need to know." The following day, Margaret remained behind as arranged. What she told Constance during the next hour would shatter the young teacher's assumptions about St. Mary's Academy. Margaret's account was both detailed and horrifying. She described the special instruction sessions, the pattern of student deaths, the mysterious nighttime visitors, and the growing evidence that the girls were being systematically poisoned. Most shocking of all was Margaret's theory about the true purpose of the academy. She believed that St. Mary's was not an educational institution at all, but rather an elaborate procurement operation designed to provide young women for the entertainment of wealthy and powerful men. "They're not just killing us, Miss Hartwell," Margaret concluded, her voice steady. "They're destroying us first. Our minds, our will, our ability to resist or escape, and then when we're too weak to fight anymore, they use us until we die. Hannah, Priscilla, Mary Catherine, they didn't die of fever or brain sickness. They were murdered as surely as if someone had put a knife through their hearts." Constance listened with growing horror and a sick certainty that Margaret's analysis was correct. But even as she accepted the truth, Constance understood the enormity of the challenge they faced. The Fairfax family was respected throughout Salem and beyond. Accusations against such people would be dismissed as slander. They would need concrete, undeniable proof. And they would need to obtain this evidence without alerting the Fairfax family to their suspicions, because discovery would mean certain death. As winter settled over Salem in 1813, two women began a dangerous game of cat and mouse with their captors. The winter of 1813 to 1814 transformed St. Mary's Academy into a battleground. Constance Hartwell and Margaret Sullivan had formed an unlikely alliance. Their different backgrounds proved to be an advantage as they developed a sophisticated intelligence operation within the Academy's walls. Their first breakthrough came through Constance's legitimate access to the Academy's administrative areas. During sessions in Victoria's office, she began to systematically examine the files and documents in her locked desk. What they discovered exceeded their worst fears. Hidden beneath conventional records were detailed ledgers that recorded financial transactions, unlike anything a legitimate educational institution would maintain. The entries were written in a coded system. Margaret's blood ran cold when she found her own entry. Subject 12, MS Red Green, 15 years. Conditioning progressing slowly. Resistance above average. Recommend increased dosage and extended isolation periods. Client interest, moderate but consistent. The clinical detachment of these notes was horrifying. The girls were not seen as human beings, but as inventory. Worse still, the ledgers contained client preferences that read like a catalog of human depravity. But the most damning evidence came in the form of correspondence between Victoria Fairfax and her clients. These letters, written in Victoria's elegant handwriting, discussed arrangements with a frankness that left no doubt about the Academy's true purpose. The systematic nature of the operation became clear. As Constance and Margaret gathered this evidence, they became increasingly aware that their own activities were being monitored. Victoria's scrutiny of Constance's behavior became more intense and pointed. The pressure increased dramatically in January of 1814 when another student died under circumstances that could no longer be dismissed as coincidental. Elizabeth Morrison, a 14-year-old, was found dead in her bed. She had shown no signs of illness before her death. The night after Elizabeth's funeral, Constance made a decision. She resolved to infiltrate one of the special instruction sessions and witness firsthand what was happening. It was an enormous risk, but she had concluded that they would never gather sufficient evidence through document analysis alone. The opportunity came on February 8, 1814. Constance's plan was audacious in its simplicity. She would conceal herself in a storage closet on the 3rd floor before the evening session began. At 8:30, Constance slipped out of her room and made her way to the servants' staircase. The 3rd floor was dimly lit, heavy with the scent of incense and something else, a sweet, cloying odor. Constance located the storage closet and positioned herself carefully. At exactly 9 hours, she heard footsteps. Through the grate, she watched as Evangeline Fairfax entered the chamber carrying a silver tray. Behind her came Bartholomew Fairfax, dressed in ceremonial robes. But it was Victoria Fairfax who commanded the room when she entered. The chamber had been transformed into something that resembled a twisted parody of a church sanctuary. As Constance watched in growing horror, the 6 selected students were led into the chamber. All were dressed in white gowns and moved with a dreamlike quality. But the true horror began when the clients arrived. 6 men, all well-dressed and prosperous, entered. Constance recognized at least 3 of them: a prominent Salem merchant, a state legislator, and a judge. What she witnessed during the next 2 hours would haunt her for the rest of her life. The special instruction was revealed to be an elaborate ritual of exploitation and abuse conducted with ceremonial precision. The drugged students were manipulated and violated while the clients observed and participated. Victoria Fairfax orchestrated the entire proceeding with efficiency. The girls were treated not as human beings but as sacred objects in a blasphemous ceremony. When the session finally ended, Constance remained hidden, too shaken to move. She had obtained the evidence she needed, but she had also learned something that filled her with despair. The scope and sophistication of the operation made it clear that challenging them would require resources and connections that she and Margaret simply did not possess. The network of powerful men included individuals with the authority to suppress investigations and discredit witnesses. As she crept back to her chamber, Constance understood that they faced a choice between certain death if they remained silent and probable death if they attempted to expose the truth. But they also carried with them the knowledge that dozens of other girls would suffer and die if the academy continued. The game of cat and mouse had entered its final phase. The end began on February 14, 1814. Constance awoke to find a note slipped under her door from Victoria, summoning her to her office immediately after morning chapel. The tone was superficially polite, but Constance recognized the underlying threat. Chapel service that morning was a study in barely controlled tension. Victoria conducted the proceedings with her usual presence, but Constance noticed subtle signs of agitation. After chapel, Constance made her way to Victoria's office. She found Victoria seated behind her desk, no longer bothering to maintain the facade. "Please sit down, Miss Hartwell," Victoria said, her voice carrying silky menace. "We have a great deal to discuss." Victoria opened a leather-bound folder that Constance recognized with a sinking heart. It contained their evidence. "Someone had betrayed them. You seem surprised," Victoria observed. "Did you really believe that your amateur espionage could escape notice? We have been monitoring your activity since your 3rd week here." The revelation hit Constance like a physical blow. Everything they had discovered had been permitted. "You were useful to us," Victoria explained. "Your presence provided an excellent test of our security procedures." As if summoned, Bartholomew Fairfax entered the office, blocking the doorway. "Miss Sullivan has been most cooperative in explaining the extent of your conspiracy," he announced. The betrayal cut deep. But as Bartholomew spoke, Constance noticed something in his eyes that suggested the situation might be more complex. Victoria rose and moved directly in front of Constance. "The question now is what to do with you," she said. She then presented a horrifying choice: join their organization or face death. As Constance struggled to respond, commotion erupted in the corridor. Shouts echoed, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. The office door burst open to admit a group of constables led by a stern-faced officer. Behind them came Margaret Sullivan, her eyes blazing with determination. "Victoria Fairfax, you are under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder," the constable announced. Victoria's composure cracked completely, but the constable was unmoved. As the Fairfax family was placed in custody, Margaret approached Constance. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you," she whispered urgently. "When they confronted me, I realized it was our only chance. I told them what they wanted to hear while I found a way to get word to the authorities." Margaret's plan had been breathtaking in its audacity. She had slipped out of the academy and gone directly to the Salem Constabulary. Her detailed knowledge had convinced the authorities to launch an immediate investigation. The prospect of arresting prominent clients had galvanized them into action. As the Fairfax family was led away, their empire began to crumble. Constables arrested Dr. Edmund Fairfax and secured the academy's records. The network of powerful men faced exposure. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the seamstress. She had been keeping detailed records of her observations for more than 2 years. Her testimony provided crucial corroboration. The trial of the Fairfax family would become one of the most sensational legal proceedings in Massachusetts history. The complete investigation revealed an operation of staggering scope that had operated for almost 3 years. Investigators determined that 43 young women had died at the academy from systematic poisoning. The trial began in September of 1814 and lasted for 7 weeks. Victoria Fairfax attempted to portray herself as a victim, but the testimony of survivors and her own records painted a different picture. Bartholomew claimed he was conducting legitimate religious ceremonies, but his defense collapsed. Evangeline was found to have been drugged consistently for more than a decade, rendering her mentally incompetent. The network of prominent clients faced varying fates. Dr. Edmund Fairfax received a sentence of 20 years in prison. Victoria and Bartholomew Fairfax were sentenced to death by hanging, making Victoria the first woman executed in Massachusetts for crimes other than witchcraft. The sentences were carried out on November 15, 1814, before a crowd of more than 2,000 spectators. Margaret Sullivan's courage made her a celebrity. She used her fame to advocate for improved protection of children, eventually establishing her own legitimate educational institution in Boston. Constance Hartwell returned to Boston and married a fellow teacher. Together, they founded a progressive school. She spent the rest of her life working to ensure that educational institutions would be subject to regular oversight. The Academy building was demolished in 1815. The site became a public park dedicated to the memory of the girls who had died there. A simple monument bears the names of all 43 victims. The most lasting impact was the changes it prompted in how educational institutions were regulated. Massachusetts became the first state to require regular inspections of all schools. But perhaps the most important legacy was the precedent it established that wealth and social position could not shield criminals from prosecution. The story of St. Mary's Academy serves as a reminder of how easily institutions designed to protect the vulnerable can be corrupted. It shows us that evil often wears the mask of virtue, and that the courage of individuals can ultimately triumph. In the words of Margaret Sullivan, spoken during her testimony, "They thought we were powerless because we were poor, because we were young, because we were alone. They thought they could use us and discard us without consequence. But they forgot that even the powerless can find power when they stand together for truth." Today, more than 2 centuries later, we still struggle with the same fundamental challenges. The girls who died at St. Mary's Academy were not forgotten by history. Their story continues to remind us that the price of allowing evil to flourish is always higher than the cost of confronting it. Their voices, silenced by their tormentors, still echo across the centuries with a simple but powerful message. Remember us, learn from our sacrifice, and never again allow such horrors to be committed in the name of virtue or faith. In remembering them, we honor not only their memory, but also our obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves. What do you think about this dark chapter in American history? Do you believe that such systematic exploitation could happen today under the cover of respectability and religious authority? Share this video with someone who appreciates true crime stories that explore deeper questions about power, corruption, and justice. Hit that like button if this investigation resonated with you, and subscribe to never miss stories that reveal the secrets others would prefer to keep buried. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Our community of truth seekers values every perspective. Until next time, remember that the past has lessons for those brave enough to listen.